Record. And here we go. Let's get this on the screen. Move you over to here. Whoops. Move you here. Move you here. Okay. So welcome everybody from near and far. Anyways, okay. So I want to do tonight, we're going to talk about two and maybe a third person. And I mentioned this before that after we've gone through these three individuals, maybe one or two more, we're going to go back and then besides we've been focusing for weeks now on various individuals, we're going to go back and actually look at what was going on. This is the micro level. In a macro level, what was really going on in the Jewish world. And to understand that, that's why we understand first about these personnel. So the first one we're going to do tonight, which I mentioned in our last class at the end, was a man named Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, known as Rabbi Chaim Volozhiner, who is his claim to fame is that he's the founder of modern yeshivot. Pretty much every yeshiva in the world, I can't say every, the majority of the yeshivot, especially in the Ashkenazi world, but even in the Sephardi world, can trace their roots back to this one man, Reb Chaim of Volozhin. So we're going to talk a little bit about him. But in order to understand a little bit about him, we have to learn about a term or a word, and that's Litvish or Litvak. We have to understand that in order to understand the time period we're talking about, and also specifically of this individual. Litvak is a Yiddishism for someone from Lithuania, not just Jews of a geographic region, but it also indicates a certain approach to religion, to intellect, to cultural tradition, and a couple of ideas. When someone says they're Litvish, or they identify, you just look at the news sometimes, and we talk about the so-called Gedolei Yisrael, or the so-called leaders of the Haredi world. You'll sometimes see a distinction made between the Litvish and non-Litvish. So what does that mean? Litvish Jewry is rooted in the concept of rationalism. It's not Hasidic tradition of Eastern Europe, centered on Lithuania, Belarus, and northeastern Poland. The style of their Torah, the style of their learning, is very analytical and very much into going to depth with Talmudic logic, especially which we're going to learn about maybe tonight, but probably next time, about what's called the Brisker Derech, the way of the Brisker Rav, who laid a foundation of a completely unique, can't say that, a unique approach to learning Torah. Litvish world is yeshiva centered, where the spiritual and communal leadership pretty much rest with the Rosh Yeshiva, and rather than with Hasidic rabbis. We talked about the Hasidic court where the Rebbe had his Hasidim. Here it's more centralized into a yeshiva, which also had the Rosh Yeshiva and other teachers. They were the ones who were the spiritual and communal leadership, and still are to this day. Intellectualism, very important. Emotional restraint. They're known more in the Litvish world for being, I don't want to use this term derogatorily, but it is used to call someone a cold Litvak or kalta Litvak. It's not a nice thing to say, but it's less in the, I'm talking more of, in very broad terms right now, of less emotional. I'll give you a true story in a second to explain what I'm talking about. And it is, especially in the post-Holocaust time period, which we are, of course, in, the yeshivas of the world, in Israel, United States, are under what's known as the Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah of Agudas Yisrael, that can trace its roots back to the beginning of this whole journey of Chaim Volozhin, which we will be speaking about in a moment. But I want to give you a brief concept. I've mentioned this story before, probably a couple years back. I know I have, but I'm still going to tell it anyways. Reb Moshe Feinstein, Zecher Tzadik V'Kadosh Livracha, had a granddaughter who was a member of our shul, Chicago, and I had a specific dream about her grandfather, about Reb Moshe, which was probably one of the most vivid dreams of my life. And I went and I told it to her the next day, and she's crying and she's like not upset. She was like just overjoyed at what this dream was about. Then she asked me to tell her husband, and he said basically, and she said, "What a cold Litvak you are." So it's like it's looked at derogatorily It's not meant to be across the board, but there's a difference within the passion of the Hasidic world and the, let's say, non-passion of the Litvish world. Again, very broad strokes. So let's talk a little bit about Chaim Volozhin. As I say, if you look at modern Jewish history, we're already talking about anything pretty much after the mid 1700s. We can pretty much call modern Jewish history. He's born in 1749, and he is probably one of the most influential figures of the modern Jewish period. The architect of the Volozhin Yeshiva and the author of a book known as Nefesh HaChaim, which we'll talk about. He shaped the course of the non-Hasidic Orthodox Judaism in Eastern Europe. And then, like I say, lays the foundation for this concept of the yeshiva system as a kind of a counterbalance to the growth of Hasidut, which is, remember, now it's in almost getting into early stages, getting to mid stages at the time he's coming into adulthood. He's born in the city of Volozhin, which is now Belarus. At that time, it was part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Interestingly enough, we've seen many times we've talked about these Gedolei Israel, these great giants. We've seen that he comes from a long lineage of tremendous Torah scholars. Now, in this particular case, his father was a respected Jew, but he wasn't a big Torah scholar. He doesn't come from that. But like many others we've seen, he was known as a child prodigy. By the age of 10, you're not hearing me wrong. By the age of 10, he was fluent in a large part of the Talmud, not necessarily by heart, but he knew you could open up the Gemara, and at 10 years old, that's the age before most kids in modern times now begin Gemara. They usually begin around the age of about 10, about 11 years old, depending on the country. Here it's earlier. He was a disciple of the Vilna Gaon. He attached himself to the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, very carefully. And he would end up becoming one of the main transmitters of the Torah of the Vilna Gaon, who became a lifelong influence on Reb Chaim Volozhin. Now, you'll notice that it's true within the Hasidic world and the non-Hasidic world. Where someone comes from, you add the letters ER at the end of the name of the city, and that becomes part of their title. For example, you talk about the Volozhin, the Chaim Volozhiner, right? You talk about the Satmar Rebbe. That's not a good example. The Satumari, which is supposedly Hungarian for Saint Mary, but that's a different story. In any case, I don't want to digress. Anyways, so let's talk about this concept of the foundation of this new kind of idea of a yeshiva. There were yeshivot before, but not of this style. 1803. So we're talking only a couple hundred years ago. 1803, 260 years, whatever, 250 years ago. Reb Chaim founds a yeshiva in Volozhin called Yeshivat Eitz Chaim. Probably is Yeshivas Eitz Chaim. Even though there were yeshivot before this time, what made it stand out was it was the first modern, centralized, full-time Torah academy. The structure, the organization had a purpose and was revolutionary. What does that mean? There were yeshivot before this. There were places where people would sit and learn here and there. It doesn't mean, but he founded a concept that it was a all-in-one place. It was a full-time Torah schedule, meaning the concept of, I don't know if it originates exactly with him, the concept in the yeshiva, what's called the Sdarim. There's a first, second, third Seder in most yeshivot. What does that mean? There's a morning Seder where the guys would, generally speaking, this is very broad terms right now, they would learn by themselves to prepare for the upcoming shiur and have a shiur. Then there'd be a mincha, a rest time, mincha. Then there's the second Seder where you learn sometimes the Gemara you'd learn in the morning, sometimes you'd add Bekias, which meant you learn a little bit less in depth, but more pages of the same or other Gemaras. Sometimes it would be dedicated to learning Musar, like Mesilat Yesharim, who we'll talk about in a little while. The third Seder is the night Seder, which could be for reviewing, it could be for preparing, self-introspection type of things. But it was fixed. If you go to, right here, the Yeshivat Birkat Moshe, you'll find also the same structure of 3 starim a day. What they do have, interestingly enough, at Birkat Moshe, If you go there for davening, you go into learning the Beit Midrash, you'll see there's a sign-up sheet in the back of the Beit Midrash. They have, I don't know when they started this, people sign up to learn Sdarim overnight. So there's always people learning the Beit Midrash 24 hours a day. His vision, it wasn't just that Rav Chaim says, okay, I'm going to have a place where people sit and learn Torah all day. That's nice. But he had a broader and grander vision. It was that the spiritual elite, he understood that not everyone's going to be this tremendous gadol and Talmud Chacham, but he understood that would be the cream of the crop, who would then continue to spread Torah beyond Volozhin, and also to do something critical. And this is going to be a topic we're going to have to deal with at least 2 or 3 classes from now, to which is called the Haskalah movement, the Jewish Enlightenment. We're not talking about the Enlightenment of the Middle Ages, which we've talked about. We're talking about the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, which eventually gives birth, in a sense, to Reform Judaism and some other things going on, which we have to get to. That's why I say I want to kind of build the personalities before we get back to the actual history. And it was to raise Talmidei Chachamim. It wasn't just to allow people to sit and learn, which was important, but also to raise Talmidei Chachamim who would be very much rooted in the Torah, both in terms of depth, in terms of quality, and loyalty to, especially loyalty to the Masorah or to tradition. Some of the features of this yeshiva, the original yeshiva or Yeshivas Eitz Chaim, there was no geographical limitation. Until now, yeshivot took students from their local area, which made sense. Remember also, we're not talking modern times with airplanes and railroads and buses and cars and trains. You're talking about 250 years ago, where modes of transportation were very different. It was mostly horse and buggy, etc. So it made sense in rare occasions that people might come from other places, but they were local yeshivot for local people. Here, there were no geographic limitations. He took students from Lithuania, Belarus, Poland. The idea of full-day learning, of rotating shifts, this idea of this Sdarim, there was never a moment when Torah wasn't being studied, because they actually had people learning overnight as well. They were independent. The yeshiva was not beholden to any other organization, anything. It allowed, therefore, to not be influenced by what we might today call it board of directors, some gevirim, people were extremely wealthy who were supporting it. It was completely independent. Obviously, they had to have financing somehow. But one of the key things that the Volozhin stressed also was analytical brilliance. Something that's known in the Torah world as lumdus, which it's modern day Hebrew, even say lamdut, no one says it's lumdus, which means deep analytical Talmudic analysis. When a person learns Gemara, for those of you not familiar, when a person learns Gemara, they can learn it, maybe learn with Rashi, understand it, and move on. They can learn with Rashi and Tosfot, which we talked about this back a number of months ago. We talked about what the Gemara is. They may learn also the commentaries in the back, the Marsha, the Rush, the Rif, the Ran. Again, these are names we've discussed in the past. But then there's this even going deeper and analyzing in a different approach, which we're going to talk about when we talk about the Brisker approach to learning. So these are some of the things that really made his yeshiva stick out as something brand new. It also was to counter Hasidism and Haskalah. Remember, he's a Talmud of the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, who was vehemently opposed to Hasidut. So one of his purposes, ideological missions, is to counter Hasidut and Haskalah. Now, it doesn't mean that Hasidut was going to destroy Judaism, and therefore they were afraid of it. Remember, we talked about the objections that Vilna Gaon had. But Haskalah could destroy Judaism. So his response to Hasidut was that he felt that there was, again, he's influenced, of course, by the teachings of his teacher, the Vilna Gaon, that it was the approach of Hasidut, their theology was dangerous, mystical. It wasn't necessarily grounded in rigorous Torah learning. The sefer that he wrote, which only came out after he passed away, called Nefesh HaChaim, was pretty much a systematic rebuttal of Hasidic theology, especially Tanya. which is interesting. I'm going to read to you two sentences. He said, well, Tanya emphasizes God's immanence. Rabbi Chaim emphasizes God's transcendence. If you're not familiar with these terms, it's fine. I'm not going to get into it. Instead of emotional or ecstatic prayer, Nefesh HaChaim asserts Torah study is the supreme form of divine service. When we're talking about Chassidut, we mentioned that one of the things that made it stand out over many others is that this idea of almost transcendentalism, and this idea of the joy and ecstasy of dveikut with God, this clinging to God, and the Luzhiner approach was tachlis. You want to serve God? How do you do it? Learn Torah. Bottom line, learn Torah as much as you can, as in depth as you can. The idea of, I'm making this up now, not making fun of anybody. The idea of whirling dervishes and dancing around and pounding on the bima and dancing and the singing and all that joy. Forget about it. Forget about it. It's all about sitting in tachlis and learning and learning and learning. That's how you connect to God. That was the approach of the Lashon Yeshiva. Now, when it came to defense against the Haskalah movement, again, the Haskalah movement generally was the Jewish Enlightenment trying to break away from normative Orthodox life to cast off the yoke of halacha, mitzvah. He saw the yeshiva pretty much as a fortress that would protect traditional Judaism. Let's talk for a minute about Nefesh HaChaim, because that is his magnum opus. That is what his major work was. Just like the Rambam, when you say, "Oh, I'm learning the Rambam," you don't learn a person, but his book, the Yad HaChazakah, also known as Mishneh Torah, written by the Rambam, his name, his acronym, became synonymous with his book. We're learning the Rambam. And we talked about that when we learned about the Rambam. Here, too, Reb Chaim Volozhin is very often known as the Nefesh HaChaim. Just like we say, the Chavetz Chaim. That wasn't his name. That was the name of his book, Chavetz Chaim. So some of the themes in his book, Nefesh HaChaim, which is found probably in almost every yeshiva, my guess is even those that are Hasidish, is 4 parts philosophical and Kabbalistic work. Structure, I have it written down, I'll tell you. Number 1, the structure of the soul and the divine image. He discusses these things in his book. Number 2, the meaning and purpose of prayer. Our Tefillah group that we meet on Sunday nights, which now is going to morph into a Mishlei group, Bezrat Hashem, very much was about this. Like, not just reading words. Understand not just what it is you're saying, why you're davening, why we say what we say. Number 3, the supremacy and cosmic role of Torah study, which I mentioned already, that Torah is not an afterthought. Torah is not what we're going to do when we can do it. It is the key and focus of the day. And he also discussed deep Kabbalistic concepts with rationalist control. This is the important part. The rationalist control means, on the one hand, he's talking about Kabbalistic and high-minded ideas, but also trying to concretize that. Now, remember, Tanya also deals with Kabbalistic ideas, but not to the same degree that he does. And within that context of Kabbalah, of these Kabbalistic ideas, he also grounds it in some form of reality, not that Kabbalah is reality, but in some kind of rationalism is probably a better word. Some of its key doctrines. Every word of Torah, even if a person doesn't fully comprehend, has an effect on the person's neshama. It elevates them, and it helps to sustain all creation. I've had many times, myself and most people, I'm sure, where you're learning something, reading something, you don't understand it 100%, but by the fact that you're just sitting and learning Torah, that alone affects your neshama. It affects the world. It affects your relationship with Hashem. If I took a book on quantum mechanics and I started to scan it and look at all the formulas, everything, it would do nothing to me except give me a headache. If I take out something in Torah and I'm reading it, and I've had it where I'm sitting and we go like, I don't understand the word I'm reading, whether it's in English or in Hebrew, and some concept I can't get. The fact that I spend time learning, that already has affected me. That's part of what their doctrine is. Davening versus learning. the emphasis on tefillah and the spiritual connection and the joy with the Hasidic world was paramount. Within the world, the Litvish world, within the world of Chaim Volozhiner, prayer is powerful, but Torah is even greater. A person who's immersed in Torah, there's a halacha, but a person who's, it's called their job, so to speak, is Torah. I'm not talking about nowadays. Talking about nowadays, you have very few people on the earth. You may have had, we have had some people. Torato umenato, his Torah is his job. Not talking someone who learns in Kola. We're talking about someone who that is all they do is they learn. Then in some cases, they actually do not even have to interrupt for davening in certain circumstances. In addition to that, the focus on Tselem Elokim, the image of God, that is refined through Torah mitzvot. It does not mean these things are not agreed to also in the Hasidic world, but we're talking about where the emphasis is more placed. Halacha. Halacha is extremely emphasized in the Volozhinic world. Not just halacha, but order. Making sure that this halacha flows from this one, from this one, from this one. And within Nefesh HaChaim, it ends up becoming probably the central text in the world of the Mitnaged, and possibly, I don't know which has more influence, honestly. That one or Mesilat Yesharim. Mesilat Yesharim is a different approach. That's a book of Musar, of self-improvement and how to act in this world and how to have a better relationship with Hashem, things to watch out for. For those of you who have learned it, whether with me or with others and by yourself, you know that it's not the kind of work we're talking about in the Nefesh HaChaim, but they have similar goals, and that is to make sure we, as people, refine ourselves the best way possible and become the best Eved Hashem or best servant of Hashem. What about Reb Chaim himself? What kind of individual was he? He was known to be extremely humble. He was known to have boundless energy. He was known to have tremendous love for his students. There are many stories of him that he stayed up many nights worrying about students who had financial problems. He sometimes fasted on their behalf. He would visit students who were sick personally. I'll tell you a true story. I have no names. There's a woman I worked with at a school. I'll leave the name of the school out even. She went to visit, I don't remember which Rebbe it was. She likes Hasidic Rebbes. She went to visit one who's like real big. I just don't remember who it was. And he said, and she went to him for a bracha. But the bracha wasn't for her. It was for her students. And the Rebbe was caught off guard. He said that's the first time a person's come in to ask for a bracha, for only one bracha and only for her students. And I was amazed by that story. She told it as part of how I found out. But this was very much the same idea of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. He took his students' lives very personally. That trickles down to modern day education, which is something that we have here that is not the same model in the United States. And that's you have a teacher in a classroom starting in 7th grade, starting Kita Zayin, even that they have them even starting in Kita Aleph, but what really is the difference is starting in Kita Zayin in 7th grade, you have a mechanech or mechanechet. It's not just what we call in the United States, the homeroom teacher. It's someone who's involved in your life. They know your family, they know your issues, they know the good, the bad, the ugly, and they're very much there for you 24/7, even on Shabbat if necessary. And I am amazed by people who are mechanchim, the good ones. Unfortunately, there are some that may not so good, but this is the same idea. This is who Reb Chaim Volozhiner was. He passed away in 1821, and his son succeeded him, a man named Rabbi Yitzchak Volozhin. And in the next couple of decades, there were so many giants of the Torah world who came from this yeshiva, the Netziv, Reb Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Beis Halevi, it's not the Beit Halevi, it's the Beis Halevi, Reb Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, not the Rav who passed away in the 1980s, from New York. We're talking about, we'll see who he was relative to him. And Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, who launched what is known as the Brisker Derech, the way of brisk. We're going to come to him maybe still tonight. We'll touch on it. Lahavdil, which means you don't want to make a comparison, but I'll make a comparison. Take a university, an American university. Let's go back 10 years. Let's not taint it with the horrific stuff that's been going on in the last few years. And you had universities that when they would put out promotional material, they would list who some of their main big time graduates were. He's a Supreme Court justice, and the important, most greatest law firm in the United States. Why? Because they were proud that these people got their roots and grew in their university, and they grew to be people who had massive influence in the United States or whatever country. Lahavdil, if you go back all the way to the time of the Volozhin Yeshiva, it gave birth to unbelievable, not just unbelievable Gedolim and great giant Torah sages, but people who absolutely changed the way we approach Torah learning. I make that statement and I stand behind it, because some of these people that we'll learn about, a couple of them, truly altered not just how Torah is learned, but how it's approached, and also yeshivot that center and focus around that kind of approach. So again, Volozhin is known as the mother of all Lithuanian yeshivot. It gave us institutions like Slobodka, Mir, Panovich, Lakewood in New Jersey. Those are all direct descendants, so to speak. Someone says, I learned in Mir, Yerushalayim. I learned in Mir. I learned in Yeshiva of Slobodka. I'm a Panovich. These names that still exist, and still people learn in these places now, which they will all be here in Israel and not Chutz La'aretz. That would be even better, but that's a different story. Those are all descendants of Reb Chaim Volozhin's Yeshiva and Volozhin of Eitz Chaim. He built an institution and a worldview of orthodoxy to resist change, modernity, to hone the skills of those who were sitting. He would not be satisfied guy just sitting and learning. He had to have goals. He had to make sure that he would be understanding, become not just a Ben Torah, but also someone who would grow in depth and in breadth. And it was a counterculture of holiness and Torah and learning amid the chaos that was brewing. He is, again, like a spoiler alert, he is one of the first lines of defense against the 19th century changes that are starting to happen within Judaism, with the Haskalamu, which we'll get back to, Bezrat Hashem. Let's talk briefly about Reb Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal. Ramchal is known for one of his main works, which doesn't even exist until after he's passed away. Ramchal lived in 1707 to 1746. He was a very young man when he passed away, but he was extremely influential in one area. We're going to see. A few years ago, when I started teaching the Mesilat Yesharim class, I gave a maybe 2-3 part introduction to his history. We're just going to do a few minutes tonight. If you're interested in knowing more about him as an individual, message me and I'll send you the links to those videos. In any case, he's born in Padua, Italy. We've been mostly focusing on Eastern Europe. Now we're moving into Italy, Padua. Reb Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, also known as the Ramchal, Reish Mem Chet Lamed, Reb Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. Once again, the same thing that has appeared to almost every single one of these people we discussed. He shows amazing acuity and brilliance at a very young age. He is not only proficient in Torah, but he's also proficient in non-Jewish things. That's not the right way to say it. In the non-Torah world, directly. Medicine, philosophy, by the way, medicine is Torah, philosophy is Torah, language is Torah, it's all Torah, everything is Torah. But I'm trying to make a distinction between sitting and learning medicine versus sitting and learning Gemara. So he was brilliant in all those things. whereas we just saw that at 10 years old, Reb Chaim Volozhin was already knowledgeable in much of Shas, of the Talmud. Moshe Chaim Luzzatto wasn't as advanced. It took him until age 14. By 14, he's immersed already, though, in Kabbalah. He's an author already at 14 of Hebrew poetry, and he is a student of a certain man named Rabbi Shaya Basan, who ends up becoming his lifelong supporter and mentor. But someone who's 14 years old, learning Kabbalah and showing this tremendous brilliance, there's always going to be a little bit of controversy involved. By the age of 20, the Ramchal claims to have received instructions from some heavenly mentor, a Magi, who's associated with some mystical figures, that he's supposed to do something with his life special. This did not sit well with the local rabbis and the other rabbis in Padua and in other places. And he is forced, number one, to stop disseminating Kabbalistic teachings. He is told to destroy some of his writings. And in order to, I don't know, save his life, maybe ad kadei kach, he runs to Amsterdam. He moves to Amsterdam, and there he authors three things. Number one, Mesilat Yesharim. If you have never learned Mesilat Yesharim, tomorrow you can go online or go to a store, get the book, start tomorrow. It is a book. It's not that big, like that. But it's a book no house should be without. It's a book that everyone should read. But you should read it many, 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 many times. If you're looking for shiurim, there's many shiurim online, my own shiurim, many other shiurim, Hebrew, English, everything. There isn't a yeshiva. Again, like I said about Nefesh HaChaim, when it comes to the shiurim, every house needs one. It is a classic sefer. It's known as Musar, which is a negative connotation. You hear Musar like, I'm no good, you're not going to be any good, you're not going to amount to anything. That's not what Musar is at all. This is about how to improve your life. It's structured very well, like a ladder. You go one step to the next step to the next step. You don't have to finish the first step before you go to the second step. It's not like I'm not making a joke. It's not like a 12-step program. If you don't do well on this one, you can't move to the next step. You can't, because you're never going to master every single thing. It's not possible, especially when you get towards the latter part of the book. Mesilat Yesharim, the paths of the just. By the way, just to point out, it doesn't say Mesilat To'im. It's not the path of those who have made mistakes. It's Mesilat Yesharim. It's already starting off with the expectation that a person's yashar, a person's straight. They just want to make sure they're straighter. They want to stay on the straight and narrow. Derech Hashem is also, I've taught Derech Hashem many years ago. It's difficult. It's not the easiest language, but it systematically presents Jewish beliefs about Hashem, Basher, providence, mitzvot, many other things. He put out another book called Da'at Tvunot. It's a book of philosophy and Kabbalah. It's a dialogue about divine justice. Honestly, I've never learned it. I'm aware of it. I've never learned it. And he also wrote many poems and compositions. He made Aliyah. He moved to Israel in 1743, his lifelong dream for his whole life, wanted to live in Israel. He arrives in the city of Akko, and he died 3 years later, evidently from a plague. He and his wife and child passed away. And he's buried, for those who've never been to the Rambam's kever, Rambam's grave in Tveria, if you go there, there are many people nearby that are buried, one of whom is the Ramchal, the Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. I highly recommend, if you like to visit Kvarim, to visit the graves of those who have passed away, who are tzaddikim. Tzfat is an unbelievable place to go. Tveria is an unbelievable place. There's all over the country, plenty of places. He had direct influence on a modern day thinker of Musar, and that was Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler. Rabbi Dessler, I don't remember the year he died. It might have been like 1959 or something. I don't remember the top of my head. He drew heavily on the ideas. Michtav Me'Eliyahu, many of you might have heard of it, seen it. Also a very worthwhile text to have in the house. And he was also, Reb Dessler Zatzal was also a tremendous influence. But what we've seen when it comes to whether it's the Vilna Gaon, or it was the Baal Shem Tov, or Reb Chaim Volozhin, or the Ramchal, they were not standalones for their generation. They are people who continue to this very day to have influence in all the Jewish households in one way or another. Probably, though, one of the greatest thinkers, greatest people that came from the house of Volozhin, the yeshiva of Volozhin, that affected the Torah world in the way it approached the learning of Torah was we call the House of Brisk. There was a city known as Brest-Litovsk. Brest-Litovsk, with the Hebrew name is Brisk. And for those of you who've heard of the Brisker method, those of you who've heard of basically it's the Soloveitchik dynasty. I'm not going to go into it starting tonight. I'm just going to give you a tiny little bit, a little introduction. For the other people we discussed their biography. We talked about who they were, what they wrote, the influences they had. But and yes, the Baal Shem Tov brought about a revolution, the Chassidut, and yes, the Vilna Gaon brought about somewhat of a revolution also in his world. Each one of them their own. But the history of a revolution in Torah learning, that can be attributed to the House of Brisk, the House of the Soloveitchik. Known the Beis Halevi, to Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, who is known as the Brisker Rav, down to Reb Yosef Dov Levi Soloveitchik of the Yeshiva University. A dynasty that has left an indelible mark on Judaism, no different than the Vilna Gaon, no different than the Baal Shem Tov in their own way. It left an indelible mark on how Torah is learned, on how we think halachically, and even how we conceive of Jewish leadership. The family, the Soloveitchik family, didn't just merely pass down Torah to the next generation. It transformed the way Torah is understood. Not only that, even more so, invented, I don't know if that's the right word, a new language of concepts, ideas, which we will learn about. For those of you, I'm sure some of you have never heard the idea of Chefza and Gavra, Siba and, oh, mine just went blank. Let me see, I have it written down. Oh my gosh, how do I forget that? Siman and Siba, Maasev versus Kiyum, Chefza and Gavra. These are terminologies of things that if you go back to the generation before the Soloveitchik dynasty, didn't exist. The phrases this idea did not exist. And they were invented, so to speak, in the early 1800s with the beginning of the House of Soloveitchik, of the House of Brisk. And Bezrat Hashem, starting, I hope, next week, all should go well, we will start to talk about the Soloveitchik dynasty, because that's truly, truly what it is. Meantime, wishing everyone a good evening. B'sorot tovot. Thank you for those who are here. Have a great night.